The fluorescent lights of the supermarket flickered above her like judgmental eyes, exposing every crack in her pride. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the small pack of diapers on the checkout counter. Only one pack, just enough to get through the weekend. Her baby hadn't stopped crying since morning, and this was her last attempt to find peace in a week that had offered none. Her hair was tied back hastily, her clothes wrinkled from too many sleepless nights. But in her eyes, there was something that couldn't be ignored. Quiet desperation disguised as strength. She handed over her card with a shaky breath, praying it wouldn't decline. It had worked yesterday for milk and baby wipes, but barely. Behind her, a line of impatient customers shifted inside. The cashier glanced at the card, then at her. Something in her expression changed. Not confusion, not annoyance, but something colder. She slid the card through the machine, hesitated, and then slowly reached for the phone beneath the register. The mother's heart dropped. "Ma'am," the cashier said, her voice flat. "Stay right here. I have to call someone." The mother blinked, confused. "Why? What happened?" Her voice cracked. The cashier didn't answer. Instead, she muttered a few words into the phone, and moments later, a security guard appeared from the end of the aisle. The mother clutched her diaper pack instinctively, as if holding it tighter would protect her child from whatever storm was now approaching. People were staring. Whispers began to swirl like smoke in the air. A mother, diapers, a card, and now, the police. She tried to explain, her voice shaking. "It's my card. It's mine, I swear. I didn't steal anything." But no one listened. The baby started to cry from the stroller behind her, as if echoing the fear his mother hadn't dared to let out. And in that moment, she realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a judgment, a sentence, and no one had even asked for her side of the story yet. What happened next would unravel not just the truth, but a chain of events that no one in that store could have predicted. Because sometimes, when the world is at its coldest, one moment of unexpected kindness can set everything on fire. The security guard approached with a cautious but firm stride, one hand resting on the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. He was used to handling shoplifters, disturbances, even the occasional aggressive customer. But this, a young woman with tear-glossed eyes and a baby strapped into a second-hand stroller? Still, orders were orders. "Ma'am, I need you to step to the side," he said. She obeyed without resistance, clutching the diapers to her chest like they were a shield against shame. The people in line behind her now had a front-row seat to what looked to them like another theft stopped in progress. Their eyes darted between her clothes, her tired posture, the screaming infant. Assumptions filled the silence. Not one of them stepped forward to ask what really happened. She could feel their judgments crawling across her skin like static, loud, invisible, and impossible to answer. "I swear I paid for it," she said again, her voice breaking. "The card, it's mine. I got the money from the church pantry. Please, I didn't steal anything." Her words spilled out quickly, like water pouring from a crack in a dam. But the cashier remained silent. She avoided eye contact, refusing to acknowledge the humanity behind the desperation. The screen on her register still blinked. Transaction failed. The baby wailed louder, overwhelmed by the rising tension in the air. The mother crouched beside him, trying to calm him, trying to calm herself. "I just needed one pack," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Just one. She had no idea that the entire situation was about to spiral further. Because just beyond the automatic doors, 2 police officers had arrived. And they weren't coming for groceries. The store grew eerily quiet as the officers entered. Shoppers lowered their eyes. A child asked his father, "What did she do?" The father didn't answer. But the truth was, she hadn't done anything. Not yet. And that would become painfully clear in the most unexpected way. The officers approached the woman slowly, their hands near their belts, but not yet reaching for anything. One of them, a younger man with a buzz cut and a clipboard tucked under his arm, spoke first. "Ma'am, we got a call about a fraudulent transaction. I'm going to need to see your ID." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Fraudulent? No, it's my card. I guess it bounced. I didn't mean to." The older officer cut her off, his tone less patient. "We just need to verify some information." He looked down at the diapers clutched in her arms, then back at the cashier. "She tried to leave the store?" The cashier shook her head quickly. No, the card didn't go through. But she got defensive. The officer nodded. Okay, that's all we need for now. No crime had been committed. But the spectacle had already written its own version of guilt. The mother fumbled through her bag, pulling out a worn wallet with frayed edges. She handed over her ID and EBT card, her fingers trembling. There's still balance on it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I checked it this morning. I wouldn't take anything. Not with my son here. But her words felt like pebbles tossed at a wall too tall to climb. The younger officer scanned the card. A pause. A beep. He looked at his screen, then back at her. You're right, he said. There's $10 left. Enough for this. He handed the card back, slowly. You didn't do anything wrong. For a moment, relief washed across her face, only to be swallowed by humiliation. The damage was already done. The eyes, the whispers, the memory her child would carry, even if he couldn't yet speak it. The older officer exhaled, annoyed, not with her, but with the situation. Next time, someone should ask before assuming the worst, he muttered, glancing at the cashier. She looked away. The truth was clear now, but the truth hadn't protected the woman from being paraded like a criminal. And as she stood there, holding the diapers tighter than ever, someone at the back of the store began walking toward her, someone who had watched the whole thing unfold and couldn't stay silent any longer. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed louder than the silence in the aisle. A tall man in a gray suit, no shopping cart in sight, stepped forward with purpose. His face was unfamiliar to most, but the cashier's expression changed the moment she saw him. Panic. Recognition. Mr. Callahan, she stammered. The man didn't answer her. He stopped in front of the mother, looked down at the diapers in her hands, and then met her eyes, kind, steady, apologetic. I saw everything, he said gently. I shouldn't have waited this long to speak. His voice cut through the tension like a warm knife through ice. Then he turned to the officers. She's telling the truth. I was 2 aisles over when it started. She never raised her voice. She never threatened anyone. She just wanted to buy diapers. The younger officer gave a slow nod, already knowing this, already feeling the weight of the spectacle pressing down on his conscience. The older officer looked less moved, but said nothing. Callahan turned to the cashier next. You escalated something that didn't need escalation. She had the funds. You didn't even check before calling the police. The cashier looked down, ashamed. I didn't think it would go that far. But it had gone that far. And now the whole store knew it. The man in the suit stepped beside the mother, lowered his voice, and said, Please, let me pay for this. You've been through enough today. She hesitated. Pride and pain twisted inside her. But then, slowly she nodded. Thank you, she whispered, unable to hold back the tears any longer. He walked with her to the register, where he placed a crisp $20 bill on the counter. Not because she couldn't pay, but because she had already paid in dignity. Ring it up again, he said. The cashier obeyed without a word. And for the first time since the ordeal began, the baby fell quiet, watching, listening, somehow sensing that something had shifted. As the receipt printed, Mr. Callahan gently handed the bag to the mother, who took it with both hands, still unsure how to process everything. You don't have to feel embarrassed, he said softly. The system failed you, but not everyone will. She nodded, biting her lip to hold back a sob. It's not just today, she admitted. It's every day. Every room I walk into feels like I have to prove I belong there, even just to feed my child. Behind them, the mood in the store had changed. People were no longer watching with suspicion. They were watching with guilt. Someone cleared their throat. Another stepped out of line, walked over, and handed the mother a gift card. For next time, the woman said quietly, I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. The mother's eyes filled again. She didn't have the words. The older officer muttered a quick goodbye and left without another glance. The younger one stayed behind for a moment. If you ever need anything, he said, handing her a small card. This has my number. Not as a cop, just as someone who's learning how to listen better. She took it, stunned. The moment felt surreal, almost like the pain had created space for something she hadn't expected. Humanity. The cashier stood frozen, her hands fidgeting with her apron. Mr. Callahan approached her before leaving. Train your eyes to look past assumptions, he said, because one day, The person you dismiss might be the one who changes everything. Then he turned and followed the mother outside, where the sky had opened just slightly, and the light drizzle of rain fell like a quiet blessing. As she buckled her baby into the car, the mother looked up at him and said, "You didn't have to help." He shook his head. "We all have to help," he replied. "It's just that some of us forget." And in that moment, surrounded by puddles and strangers who'd learned something they never expected to, she no longer felt alone. The parking lot was nearly empty as she settled behind the wheel, the baby quiet now, playing with the edge of a blanket. She sat still for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. Her breath came slow, deep. The chaos had passed, but the weight lingered. Not the shame anymore, but the heaviness of being seen. Truly seen. For years, she had moved through the world unnoticed, or worse, misjudged. And now, one stranger's courage had rewritten that narrative in front of dozens of witnesses. Inside the store, the atmosphere was still thick with reflection. The line at the register moved, but not with its usual rush. People were quieter, more careful with their words. One man who had muttered under his breath during the confrontation now approached the cashier. "Do you know her name?" he asked. The cashier shook her head. "No, I never asked." The man sighed. Then maybe that's where it all went wrong. In the break room, the younger officer sat with a cup of coffee the manager had offered him. He stared down at the rim, playing back every detail of the last 30 minutes. "It could have gone so differently," he muttered to himself. The store manager, who'd watched from a security monitor but never stepped in, stood nearby. "We train for theft, not compassion," he admitted. "Maybe that needs to change." Meanwhile, Mr. Callahan stood by his car, watching the mother's vehicle as it slowly pulled out of the parking lot. He wasn't thinking about headlines or recognition. He was thinking about his own mother, a woman who had once stood at a counter just like that, wallet nearly empty, and dignity hanging by a thread. He had been a boy then, too young to understand the ache in her silence. Now he understood all too well. Back on the road, the mother didn't cry. She didn't break. Instead, she drove in silence, her eyes steady on the street ahead. Because something inside her had shifted. She still didn't have much, but she had a story now. A story where she wasn't just a statistic. Where, just for one day, someone had fought beside her and turned the entire world around. That evening, the sun dipped low behind gray clouds, casting long shadows across the city. In a modest apartment just outside town, the mother laid her baby down in his crib. He was finally asleep, cheeks soft and warm, a faint smile curling on his lips. She sat beside him on the floor, staring at the half-full package of diapers beside the dresser. It was nothing extraordinary, just a simple plastic pack. But to her, it now carried the weight of a war survived. Her phone buzzed once. A message from an unknown number. She opened it cautiously. It was a short text from the younger officer. "You were brave today. I hope you know that." She stared at the screen, unsure whether to respond. After a long pause, she typed back, "It's not bravery. It's just being a mom." And, somehow, that felt like the truest thing she had ever said. Elsewhere in the city, Mr. Callahan sat at his desk in a corner office, a pile of untouched papers in front of him. His assistant knocked, reminding him of a meeting. He waved it off. His mind wasn't on business. It was on the woman, the child, the silence in that store, and the crowd that chose judgment over empathy, until one voice shifted everything. He opened his laptop and began to write. Not an article, not a speech, just a memory. Because stories, when preserved, become lessons. And across the street from the store, now closing for the night, the cashier sat on a bench, her apron folded in her lap. She replayed the moment again and again, the weight of her inaction pressing harder each time. Her phone lit up with a message from her mother. "How was your day?" She didn't answer right away. For the first time in a long while, she didn't have a simple answer. Because that day hadn't been normal. It had been a mirror, one that showed each person who they really were, and who they still had a chance to become. The next morning brought with it an unusual calm. The mother stood at the window, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug, watching as sunlight broke gently through the clouds. It felt different today. She couldn't explain why, but something inside her had softened. Not in surrender, but in clarity. After so many days spent bracing for survival, she had tasted something rare, grace. And now, even silence felt less like loneliness and more like rest. She turned back toward the crib, where her baby slept peacefully. His tiny chest rose and fell beneath the thin blanket, unaware of the chaos his mother had shielded him from. She reached out, brushing a finger over his soft curls. "You'll grow up strong," she whispered. "Not because I had everything, but because I refused to give up." Elsewhere, in a downtown coffee shop, Mr. Callahan sat with a laptop open and a cappuccino growing cold beside him. The piece he had written the night before now lived on his screen, a raw, simple retelling of what had happened. He hadn't planned to share it, but something urged him to press submit. Within hours, the story went live on a quiet blog he rarely used. He didn't expect it to go anywhere, but it did. By midday, the post had been shared over 10,000 times. Not because it was perfectly written, but because it was painfully true. Strangers left comments. Parents, cashiers, police officers, people who had seen versions of that story unfold and had stayed silent. The internet, so often a place of noise and fury, had become, at least for a moment, a place of reflection. At the supermarket, the shift manager was the first to see the article. She read it twice before realizing it was their store. Her cashier, that mother. She closed the office door behind her and sat at the desk in stunned silence. The names weren't listed. The writer had been kind, but the truth didn't need names to sting. It knew exactly where to land. She called a staff meeting before the next shift began. For once, the tone wasn't about quotas or shrinkage. It was about compassion. "We failed someone yesterday," she said, "and I don't want that to happen again." Some nodded quietly. Others avoided her gaze. But one by one they listened. Because what had once felt like an isolated moment now had the weight of a story the world had seen. The cashier didn't speak at first, but when the room emptied, she remained behind. "I didn't know what to do," she confessed, her voice raw. "I thought I was doing the right thing. But now, I just feel like I made her feel small." The manager sat beside her. "Then don't let that be the end of it," she said. "Fix what you can. Start where you are." That night, the mother returned to the same store. Not out of habit, but necessity. She held her breath as she entered, half expecting the same cold stares, the same tension. But instead, the woman at the register paused, looked up, and said, "I saw the article. I'm so sorry for what happened. I didn't listen yesterday, but I am now." And for the first time, the mother saw the kind of eyes that meant it. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply nodded and whispered, "Thank you." Because healing doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it comes in whispers. The article continued to spread across social media, moving beyond blogs and quiet corners of the internet into major platforms, morning shows, and local news. But for the mother, life didn't suddenly change. She still woke up to stretch every dollar, still counted diapers and jars of baby food like blessings. But something had shifted, not outside but inside. She no longer walked with her eyes down. She held her head just a little higher. Because now, the world had heard her. Messages began arriving, some from strangers, others from neighbors who had never spoken to her before. One woman dropped off a grocery bag at her door with a sticky note. "You're not invisible. You're seen." Another offered to babysit once a week so she could rest. These weren't grand gestures, but to someone who had carried the weight of silence for so long, they felt like small revolutions. Mr. Callahan, too, received hundreds of responses. Emails from parents, veterans, immigrants, even former cashiers. One message came from a woman across the country. "I was that mother once. I never forgot the way people looked at me, but now I feel like someone's finally telling our story." He read every message, replied to as many as he could, and quietly wondered why it had taken so long for this kind of story to matter. Back at the store, a small sign appeared near the registers. It read, "We don't just scan items. We see people." It was simple, almost too simple, but employees began treating it as a quiet promise. There was more eye contact now, more patience, more moments where someone paused to ask instead of assume. It wasn't perfection, but it was change. And as for the mother, she started writing too. Not for the internet, not for applause, but for herself. Late at night, while her son slept, she scribbled words into a notebook. About dignity, about survival, about the day the world finally saw her. Not as a burden, not as a thief, but as a mother doing her best and never giving up. Weeks later, the mother received a letter in the mail, an envelope with no return address. Inside was a note written in careful, practiced cursive. Your strength saved me. I was behind you in line that day. I said nothing, but I will never stay silent again. Tucked inside was a crisp $50 bill. She stared at it for a long time before placing it in a jar labeled simply, Better Days. She didn't see herself as a hero. She didn't see herself as brave. But the moment had changed her. Not because someone paid for her diapers, but because someone stood with her when everyone else turned away. That moment taught her that sometimes justice doesn't come from courtrooms or headlines. It comes from presence. From one person deciding to say, enough. Mr. Callahan received an invitation to speak at a local community center. He didn't expect it, but he agreed. When he stood in front of the small crowd, mostly parents, mostly tired, mostly unseen, he didn't talk about the store. He talked about what happens when one human being refuses to let another be humiliated alone. We don't need to be heroes, he said. We just need to see. The younger officer eventually visited the store again, this time off duty. He didn't wear his badge. He didn't ask for attention. He just walked the aisle slowly, thinking. When he reached the checkout line, he saw the mother again. She was holding a larger pack of diapers this time, and when she saw him, she smiled, not out of obligation, but recognition. He nodded back, placed a pack of formula on the counter beside hers, and quietly said, for your next week. She accepted. No speeches, no spotlight, just two people choosing not to look away. Spring arrived slowly that year, bringing warmer air and the kind of light that lingered longer in the evening. The mother began walking her son through the neighborhood more often, passing the same grocery store that had once been the setting of her worst humiliation. But now, when she passed it, she didn't look away. Sometimes she even went inside, not because it had changed completely, but because she had. People recognized her more often now, not as that woman from the store, but as someone who had endured something difficult with dignity. A few strangers would smile as she walked by. One teenage boy at the deli counter quietly handed her a coupon and said, my mom read about you. She said you remind her of herself. She nodded gently, unsure how to respond, but deeply moved. Meanwhile, inside the store, the cashier who at first judged her kept showing up for work with something new in her eyes. Awareness. She wasn't perfect. Sometimes she still hesitated, but she was trying. One afternoon, she approached the mother with a tentative look and said, I've been reading, learning. I know an apology can't fix everything, but I am sorry. The mother looked at her and offered a small, sincere smile. Thank you for saying that, she replied. That's where change begins. Back at the community center, Mr. Callahan was helping launch a new local program, quietly inspired by her story. It was a simple fund, supported by community donations, to cover the immediate needs of parents in crisis. Diapers, formula, food. No forms. No shame. Just help. He named it the Line Fund, not for a grocery line, but for the invisible one that divides the ignored from the seen, and the people brave enough to cross it. And through it all, the mother never once considered herself anything special. She still struggled, still stretched, still hoped. But when she kissed her son goodnight, she did so with the quiet knowledge that, even in the smallest moments, she had done something powerful. She had endured with grace, and the world had finally paid attention. That grace, once overlooked, had now become a source of quiet strength in the community. Other mothers began coming forward, some sharing their own stories at small gatherings, others writing letters to the local paper. There was no trend, no movement, no campaign, just a slow, organic rise of voices that had long been silenced. They didn't need a spotlight. They needed each other. In one of these gatherings, seated in a circle of folding chairs, the mother was asked to speak. She hesitated at first, nerves rising in her throat, but then she saw the faces around her. Tired, hopeful, familiar. I don't have the right words, she said, but I can tell you this. What happened to me in that store made me feel small. What happened after made me feel real. I don't want sympathy. I want change. And I think it starts with us. Applause wasn't loud, but it was heartfelt. And after the event, a woman approached her in tears. I never told anyone this, she whispered, But I once walked out of a store without diapers because I was too afraid my car would decline. I held my baby all night, terrified. You gave me the courage to speak." Mr. Callahan stood in the back of the room that night, listening. He didn't need to be part of the circle. He didn't need credit. He just needed to see that something he'd done, something she had survived, had grown roots. Stories, he realized, are like seeds. But only when we choose to tell them do they begin to bloom. And the mother? She went home, kissed her son on the forehead, and added another line to her notebook. "Today I spoke, and they listened." No longer invisible, no longer silent. Just a mother, resilient, seen, and writing a story far bigger than even she could yet imagine. The city's local news eventually picked up the story, not just a viral article, but the ripple effect it had created. A quiet movement had formed, one that didn't march or shout, but healed in small, consistent gestures. The segment was brief, a soft-spoken voiceover, images of a modest grocery store, a worn park bench, a mother smiling with her baby in her arms. There were no names, just the story of a moment that changed many. People began leaving packages of diapers and formula in donation boxes outside stores. One supermarket chain added a button to its self-checkout screen. Pay it forward. Customers could round up their purchases to donate a small amount to local parents in need. No bureaucracy, no shame, just neighbors helping neighbors. The mother never asked for this. She simply became the spark that reminded everyone what dignity looks like under pressure. Back at home, she watched the news clip late one evening, her baby asleep on her chest. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't moved, but because something deeper had replaced the tears. Peace. It wasn't about recognition or public praise. It was about the fact that the moment which had almost broken her had now helped others stand taller. Sometimes, she thought, being seen isn't about having a voice loud enough to be heard. It's about having a story true enough to be felt. Mr. Callahan received a message from an old friend that night. "I used to think kindness was weakness. Your story proved it's the strongest thing we have." He reread that message 3 times. Then he replied, "Kindness is easy. Courage is harder." That mother showed both. And he meant every word. She had reminded him of a truth he hadn't realized he'd forgotten. And while the world continued spinning, bills to pay, mouths to feed, days to survive, something in the city had shifted. Not in law, not in politics, but in people. They looked each other in the eye a little longer. They asked one more question before passing judgment. Because once you've truly seen someone, it becomes a lot harder to pretend they don't matter. Weeks later, at a quiet Saturday market, the mother was browsing through a small vendor stall, just looking, not buying. The vendor, an older woman with silver hair and weathered hands, leaned over and said gently, "You're the one from the story, aren't you?" The mother froze for a second, unsure how to respond. Then she nodded slowly. The vendor smiled. "My daughter was in a similar spot once. I just want to say thank you for standing there, for not giving up. It was never about being famous. It was about being real." And now, wherever she went, people approached not with curiosity, but with gratitude. And she received it not with pride, but with grace. Because she knew, for every one person who stopped her, there were hundreds more still walking their quiet battles, waiting to be seen. The grocery store had changed too, not just in policy, but in tone. There was now a small shelf near the front door with essentials, diapers, wipes, formula. Above it, a handwritten sign, "Take what you need. Leave what you can." No questions asked. The cashier who had once called the police now managed that shelf, restocking it every day with quiet devotion. One day, the mother brought a small pack of wipes to add to the shelf, not because she had extra, but because she understood. As she placed it there, she looked over and saw another woman, young, tired, familiar. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No words passed between them. But in that glance, a message was exchanged. "I see you. I know. You're not alone." And that's how change stays alive. Not in speeches or slogans, but in the moments where pain meets empathy, and strangers become mirrors of one another's strength. The seasons began to shift again, early signs of summer brushing against the city's tired sidewalks. Life, for most, returned to its usual pace. But for those touched by the story, something had stayed. In the homes of young parents, in quiet checkout lines, In classrooms where teachers now included empathy as part of the lesson plan, her story lingered like a quiet anthem, a reminder of what happens when we choose compassion over assumption. The mother had begun volunteering once a week at the local pantry, the same one that had helped her survive so many uncertain days. She didn't do it for recognition. She did it because she understood the look in people's eyes when they stepped through the door, the weight, the worry, the silent math of trying to make $10 stretch through the weekend. She met them without pity, just presence. One day, she noticed a young father struggling to carry 2 bags while cradling a sleepy toddler. Without a word, she walked over and offered to hold the bags. "You don't have to," he said, trying to be polite. She smiled. "I know," she replied. "That's exactly why I want to." He blinked, caught off guard not by the help, but by the way it was offered, with dignity intact. Meanwhile, Mr. Callahan, now helping lead the growing Line Fund initiative, quietly ensured that her son would never go without essentials again. He didn't tell her. He didn't want thanks. He just remembered what it meant to watch her own mother struggle, and he couldn't bear the thought of another child carrying that memory. One night, as she sat by the crib, rocking gently in a chair with her son in her arms, she whispered, "You changed me," without ever saying a word. And maybe that was the truth of it all, but the strength to stand, to survive, to love fiercely through humiliation hadn't come from outside. It had come from him, from the quiet, unrelenting need to be his safe place, even when the world wasn't hers. The city council, moved by the viral story and the growing demand for tangible support, invited several community members to speak at a special hearing on family welfare. Among them was the mother. She hesitated before saying yes, but the truth was her story had already been spoken by others. Now it was her turn to own it, to speak not as a victim, but as a witness to transformation. The chamber was filled with press, policymakers, and citizens. But when she stepped to the podium, she didn't speak to the cameras. She spoke to the single mother sitting on a worn couch at home, afraid to check her bank balance. To the cashier clocking into work with a heart still learning how to listen. To the stranger in the back of a store who wonders if kindness still matters. "I didn't come here to accuse," she said. "I came here to remind you. People are not transactions." There was silence when she finished. Not the uncomfortable kind, the reverent kind. Then came the applause, not explosive but steady, measured, earned. And somewhere in the crowd, Mr. Callahan watched with quiet pride. Not because she had spoken well, but because she had spoken bravely. The little moment he had once stepped into had grown into a chorus of thousands. Later that week, she returned to the same store for milk and bread. As she walked in, a little girl tugged her mother's hand and pointed, "Mommy, that's the lady from the story." The mother crouched and smiled. "She's the reason we give extra at the shelf." And for the first time, the woman from the story wasn't just a reminder of pain. She was a symbol of what could happen when shame meets justice and loses. And through it all, she remained unchanged in one way. She kept showing up. To the store, to the pantry, to her son's crib each night. Because the real legacy of her story wasn't in what went viral. It was in what endured quietly, beneath the surface, where dignity grows roots. Summer deepened, bringing long evenings filled with golden light, and the hum of neighborhoods slowly blooming with connection. The mother often walked her son to the park near the edge of town, a place that once felt too far, too exposed. Now it felt like home. There, she would sit on a shaded bench, diaper bag by her side, notebook in her lap. She had started writing again, not just fragments of her day, but full pages. Memories, dreams, reflections. For the first time in years, her story was not a secret she carried in silence. It was a truth she nurtured in ink. One afternoon, a woman with 2 children approached shyly. "Are you the one who—" she began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. The mother simply nodded. "Yes," she said, "but I'm also just someone who gets it." The woman sat beside her, and they talked, not about headlines or hashtags, but about rent, formula, and the way loneliness sometimes feels louder in the grocery aisle than anywhere else. They laughed, too, because survival has its moments of joy, when shared between those who truly understand. Elsewhere in the city, the Line Fund had grown faster than anyone expected. Thanks to thousands of small donations, none greater than $20, it had quietly fed over 200 families in just 2 months. Not one recipient had to prove their worth. There were no forms, no vetting, just a simple, radical trust that need was enough. That approach, controversial to some, became a model for others. Because sometimes the boldest policy begins with the most basic belief that people are telling the truth. Mr. Callahan was invited to speak on panels and at universities, but he always said no. Let the mother speak, he would say. It's her story. I just did what all of us should have done. When someone called him a hero, he corrected them. She was the one holding diapers while the world turned its back. I just turned back around. And through all this, the mother never stopped doing the one thing she had done long before the world knew her name. She kept showing up. For her son, for herself, for others like her. Because once you've been seen in your most fragile moment and still stood tall, you realize no one can take that power from you again. By midsummer, the grocery store had installed a mural on the wall above the Take What You Need shelf. Painted by local artists, it depicted a mother and child, faces gentle, eyes fierce, standing in front of a line of shadowy figures, each transformed by a beam of light. Above the mural, in large letters, it read, "We see you now." The first time the mother saw it, she stood still for a long time, her child resting against her shoulder. Tears filled her eyes, not because she wanted credit, but because she had once stood in that very spot, heart pounding, face burning, while the world decided who she was without even asking. Now, that space bore witness to a different truth, her truth. She touched the edge of the wall gently, her son looking up at the colors. "That's us," she whispered. Not literally, but in spirit, in survival, in transformation. Around her, people passed without knowing. But she didn't need their recognition. She had rewritten what it meant to walk through those doors. On the same day, halfway across the city, a group of high school students discussed her story in a civics class. The teacher, inspired by the article, had asked each student to reflect on a moment when they had judged someone without understanding their story. One student wrote, "I used to think struggling meant failing. Now I think struggling means fighting." Another wrote, "Maybe the most important laws aren't the ones we write, but the ones we live by: compassion, patience, respect." And in a small, quiet apartment filled with the sound of a child laughing, the mother wrote in her notebook once more. She wrote not to remember what happened, but to remind herself of who she became after it. Stronger, softer, unafraid. A woman who had once been treated like a problem, and rose as a voice that changed everything. The air turned cooler as summer began to yield to early signs of autumn. The baby, no longer a newborn, had started to toddle around the apartment, his laughter bouncing off the walls like sunlight. The mother followed his steps closely, one eye always watching, one heart always open. Her world remained modest, her income limited, but something more valuable had taken root. Security born from community, from knowing she wasn't alone. That week, she was invited to a university panel on economic justice. She hesitated before saying yes. Standing before strangers still stirred fear. But she went, not to perform, not to relive her trauma, but to speak plainly. She wore a simple blouse, pulled her hair into a braid, and walked into the lecture hall like a woman who belonged there. Because now, she knew she did. "I don't have statistics," she began, her voice steady. "I only have what I lived. I know what it feels like to be followed in a store, to have a card decline and feel 50 eyes on your back. I also know what it means when one person chooses to step forward instead of turning away. That kind of kindness doesn't just help, it saves." The room was silent, not in boredom, but in awe. Professors leaned in. Students scribbled notes not because they had to, but because they wanted to remember. One young woman raised her hand, voice shaking. "How do you forgive the world when it's been so cruel?" The mother paused. Then she answered softly, "I don't wait for the world to be kind. I build the kind of world my son deserves. That's how I forgive it. I do better." Later, alone in the hallway, one student approached her. "You made me want to call my mom," he said. "I didn't realize what she might have carried while raising me alone." She nodded, tears in her eyes. Because sometimes the biggest shifts don't happen through protests or policy. They happen when someone sees their own story in someone else's survival. That night, after putting her son to sleep, she sat on the couch in the dark, a quiet smile lingering on her lips. The apartment was still small. The budget was still tight. But something had changed inside her, permanently. She had walked through fire with her child in her arms, and come out whole. Not unscarred, not untouched, but whole in a way that could never be taken. The story had long stopped trending online, but its legacy lived on in the everyday. The shelf at the store, the fun that kept growing, the mural that no longer needed explanation. Every now and then, someone would send her a message. I just wanted to thank you. I see the world differently now. And she would read it quietly, heart full, knowing the change had never been hers alone. It had spread, person to person, moment to moment. Mr. Callahan kept in touch, though less frequently now. Not because the bond had weakened, but because his part in the story had ended the way it should, not as a savior, but as a witness. He often told people, I didn't change her life. She changed mine. And every time he passed that store, he looked at the plaque beside the shelf and smiled. Proof that kindness leaves fingerprints long after the moment is gone. Her son, now walking, now speaking, would one day learn the full story. But until then, he lived in the warmth of a mother who had reclaimed her voice, who had taken a moment of public humiliation and turned it into a lesson for the world, who had shown everyone watching that sometimes courage isn't loud. It's simply a mother refusing to disappear. And as she closed her notebook that night, the last line she wrote before sleep was not about pain. It wasn't about fear. It was this: we are never just one moment. We are who we become afterward. As the leaves began to turn, painting the sidewalks in amber and gold, the mother found herself walking slower during her errands, taking in the changing world with new eyes. Each step felt grounded. Each glance at her son filled her with a sense of quiet triumph. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that settles deep in your bones. The kind that says, we made it through that storm, and we're still standing. One day, as she waited in line in a new grocery store across town, her son tugged on her hand and pointed to the checkout lane. Mommy, that lady's crying, he said in a soft voice. She looked up. Ahead of them, a woman, maybe mid-30s, alone, was fumbling with a card at the register, her eyes darting, face flushed with shame. The total on the screen blinked back at her. $19.47. Her card had just been declined. Without a word, the mother stepped forward. Put it on mine, she said to the cashier. The woman looked at her, stunned. You don't have to. The mother smiled gently. I know. That's why I'm doing it. She swiped her card with calm confidence. The cashier nodded. The groceries were bagged. And, just like that, another weight was lifted, not by pity, but by shared understanding. The woman whispered, Thank you. But the mother just squeezed her hand lightly and said, Pass it on, when you can. Her son smiled, holding her hand a little tighter. He didn't know it, but in that moment, he wasn't just watching his mother help someone. He was watching her teach him how to live. They left the store, groceries in tow, hearts a little lighter. The world hadn't changed overnight, but she had. And sometimes, that's how it begins. Not with revolutions, but with one quiet decision to show up with kindness where the world least expects it. In the months that followed, she continued to write. Her notebook pages multiplied. Entries about ordinary days, small victories, the weight of exhaustion, and the lightness of hope. She didn't write for an audience. She wrote because every word gave her back another piece of herself. Her notebook became sacred, a home for the things she was too tired to speak out loud, and too strong to forget. One evening, she shared one of her entries at a community open mic night. It wasn't planned. Someone had dropped out, and the host asked if anyone wanted to fill in. Her friends looked at her. She hesitated, then stood. Her hands trembled as she held the microphone, but her voice didn't falter. This is from the day after the store, she said. When I realized I hadn't just survived, I had shifted something. When she finished reading, the room was silent, then erupting with applause. People stood. Some wept. But what mattered most was the man in the back who approached her afterward. He was older, a retired police officer, quiet and sincere. I was one of the first to read the article, he said. It made me rethink how I talk to people in crisis. You changed the way I see my own past. She didn't reply right away, but she took his hand. And that was enough. More invitations followed. More platforms. But she stayed rooted. She spoke when she felt led, never for attention, never for praise. Because her story didn't need lights, it needed listening. And every time someone listened, a new crack in the wall of indifference gave way to something softer. And at the heart of it all was her son, now older, now running ahead of her on the sidewalk, calling back with laughter. He didn't know the full story yet. But he knew this. Wherever his mother went, people stood a little straighter. Because she wasn't just someone who endured injustice. She was someone who turned it into a doorway for everyone else to walk through. As autumn deepened and the air turned crisp, the mother began receiving letters from strangers, some handwritten, some typed, each one a fragment of someone else's invisible burden. One came from a teenage girl who wrote, "I watched the video of your speech in class. I showed it to my mom. We cried together. Thank you for being brave when I didn't know how to be." Another, from a father in a distant city, "I judged someone once like they judged you. Your story taught me how to undo that moment, starting with my own kids." She kept the letters in a small wooden box by her bedside, not to collect praise, but to remind herself, on the harder days, why her voice mattered, why her silence had never been weakness, but waiting for the right time, the right moment, the right people who would listen with their hearts, not just their ears. And now that they were listening, she wouldn't go quiet again. One Saturday morning, she was invited to read to a group of children at the local library. She brought her son along, who sat in the front row, legs crossed, eyes wide. She chose a story about a lion who couldn't roar, but who saved the jungle anyway. After the reading, one little girl raised her hand and asked, "Do you ever get scared?" The mother smiled and replied, "Yes, but I talk anyway, because my voice isn't just mine. It belongs to every person who's ever been scared too." The librarian approached afterward and said, "You don't just read stories. You are one." The mother nodded gently. She understood now that every quiet act, every seemingly small choice to speak up, had begun building a bridge between people who once stood on opposite sides of fear. And that bridge had been forged not through power, but through pain, turned to purpose. That night, as her son drifted off to sleep, he whispered, "Mommy, will you write about me too?" She kissed his forehead and whispered back, "You're already in every word." The seasons changed again, ushering in winter, and with it, another layer of stillness. The world moved on, as it always does, but the roots of her story had dug in deep. The grocery store mural was now a known landmark, often photographed and posted online with captions like, "This place made me believe in people again." The shelf below, it remained full, sometimes because of community donations, other times because people who once took were now returning to give. The mother's life hadn't become glamorous. There were still bills, still worries, still nights where the fridge was too quiet. But her sense of worth no longer wavered with the weight of her wallet. Because she had learned something invaluable. The world could not define her by what she lacked. She had rewritten her identity through presence, through grace, through truth. She began mentoring younger mothers, some from shelters, others newly arrived in town. She didn't have much to give but time, stories, and her own mistakes offered without shame. One woman asked her, "How did you survive that day in the store?" The mother looked her in the eye and said, "I didn't survive that day. I changed because of it, and I've been changing others ever since." During a city holiday event, the mayor mentioned her story briefly, not by name, but as an example of how one quiet moment of dignity can lead to community transformation. She stood in the crowd beside her son, bundled in his coat, his gloved hand wrapped in hers. He looked up and whispered, "That's about you, isn't it?" She smiled, leaned down, and whispered back, "It's about us." Because that was the truth she had carried from the very beginning. Her story had never been about one woman trying to buy diapers. It was about the silent battles so many fight every day, and what happens when the world finally decides to fight with them instead of against them. As the new year began, the mother sat at her small kitchen table, flipping through the pages of her notebook. Each line held a memory, some painful, some powerful, all of them real. On the first page, written in shaky handwriting months ago, she had scrawled, "No one listens until it's too late." She paused now, reading it again, then crossed it out. Beneath it, she wrote, Some do. And when they listen, everything begins. That same week, she received a call from a teacher at her son's preschool. The children were doing a project on heroes in our lives, and her son had drawn a picture of her standing in front of a store with a cape made of hearts. He told us, the teacher said gently, that his mom helps people feel brave. The mother's eyes filled, not because of the compliment, but because her son didn't remember the humiliation. He remembered the healing. In another part of town, Mr. Callahan stood in front of a university ethics class as a guest speaker. He shared the story once more, this time with students who hadn't been old enough to read the original article when it was published. But he didn't talk about the virality or the public reactions. He talked about the courage it takes to interrupt injustice in real time. You don't have to be a hero, he said. You just have to not look away. The Line Fund expanded into other cities now, replicated by communities who saw how small acts could create massive waves. None of them used her name. She had asked not to be spotlighted. But each coordinator knew where the idea came from, and the spirit behind it. Dignity. Trust. No red tape. Just belief in people's unseen battles. And one quiet evening, as she watched her son fall asleep, she whispered a promise to herself. I will keep showing up. For him. For others. For the parts of the world still learning how to listen. And in that moment, it wasn't about memory or fame. It was about choosing, every day, to turn pain into presence. That spring, she was invited to contribute to a published anthology, Voices from the Line. It featured essays, reflections, and short stories from people who had experienced similar moments of judgment, silence, and transformation. Her chapter was placed first, not because she asked, but because the editors believed her story had opened the door for everyone that followed. She wrote it late at night, her son asleep, the window cracked open to lead in the hum of the city. The essay didn't focus on the humiliation. It focused on what happened after. On the strangers who stepped forward. On the cashier who changed. On the shelf that stayed stocked. On the ripple. She titled it simply, One Pack of Diapers. At the book launch, she sat in the back, unannounced, watching as readers approached the table, flipping through pages she had bled into. One woman clutched the book and whispered to a friend, I lived this. Another said, this is what hope looks like when you give it a chance. The mother didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her words had already done what she'd always hoped. They reached someone who needed them. Outside the bookstore, her son ran ahead of her on the sidewalk, pointing out flowers blooming through cracks in the pavement. Look, Mommy. They came back. She smiled, heart full. They always do, baby, if you give them enough light. And though he didn't yet understand, he laughed, nodded, and ran on, carrying her story in his joy. And as the city moved on, busy and loud, one woman kept walking with quiet strength, leaving invisible footprints in every heart she touched. Because hers was never the story of a victim. It was the story of a voice that rose in the smallest, bravest way and reminded the world that compassion is not a luxury. It's a choice. One that, when made, can change everything. Months passed, but her story refused to fade. Not because people kept retelling it, but because the people it had touched kept living it. A barista in a cafe began placing a small sign near the register. No one leaves without milk. A gas station clerk kept a drawer of baby essentials under the counter for parents who came up short. And in every one of these places, the spirit of her moment, the one that could have broken her, was being transformed into quiet revolutions. The mother, meanwhile, had begun working part-time at a nonprofit that helped women re-enter the workforce after hardship. She wasn't the director. She wasn't the face. She was the one who stayed late helping someone fix a resume, or practiced interview questions with a nervous mother. And that was enough for her, because she knew how it felt to have nowhere to turn, and how one open door could change everything. One afternoon, a young woman arrived at the nonprofit with a baby on her hip and fear in her eyes. She barely spoke above a whisper, her voice cracking as she explained that her card had been declined for diapers earlier that week. The mother looked at her for a long moment, then smiled gently. I've been there, she said, and I promise, it doesn't end there. She opened a cabinet, pulled out a pack of diapers, and handed it over. This time, no judgment, just help. The woman cried, clutching the bag to her chest. And in that tearful silence, Another link was added to the chain of compassion. Another life was touched, not by programs or policies, but by presence. The mother didn't need to be known. She needed to be useful. And in that moment, she was exactly what she once needed. Back at home, her son, older now, more curious, asked if he could read the book she was in. She smiled and said, "One day." And when he asked why people always seemed to hug her in the grocery store, she replied, "Because kindness travels, even long after the moment is over." As summer returned once more, she was invited to speak at a national conference on social impact. She almost declined, still unsure if her voice belonged on such a stage, but her friends insisted. "You're not there to impress anyone," one said. "You're there to remind them." So she flew to a city she had never been, stepped into a hotel ballroom filled with policymakers, activists, and nonprofit leaders, and took the microphone with steady hands. She told the story simply, without drama. She didn't embellish. She didn't condemn. She just laid it bare. The fear, the shame, the humiliation, and the moment someone chose to stand beside her. She spoke of shelves filled by strangers, of cashiers who had learned to pause, of children growing up in homes where survival was not a source of shame, but a symbol of strength. "I was not remarkable," she said. "I was desperate, but someone saw me. And from that seeing, something remarkable happened." The room was silent. Then someone stood, then another, and then everyone, not for performance, but for reverence, because they weren't just applauding her story. They were committing to carry it. After the conference, she walked through the city, her feet tired, her mind still humming with the energy of the day. She passed a bookstore and noticed a copy of the anthology in the window. It wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the world. And that was exactly as it should be. That night, back in her hotel room, she wrote in a new journal, "I no longer walk into rooms wondering if I belong. I walk in knowing that someone like me, someone tired, someone real, someone brave, always has a place." As the years unfolded, her story took root in quiet corners all around the country. It was no longer tied to her name, no longer a trending article or a viral post. It had become a kind of shared memory, passed along in the way people spoke softer at registers, and how someone paused before calling security, in the small shelves of free essentials popping up in unexpected places, with no fanfare, just faith in strangers. The movement had outgrown her, and that, she knew, was the greatest sign it had worked. Her son, now tall and confident, knew the full story. He had asked for it one evening, just before bed, older now, ready for the truth. She told him everything, not just what happened at the store, but how it felt, what it taught her, and what it built afterward. When she finished, he didn't ask questions. He simply said, "You were a hero before anyone knew it, weren't you?" She laughed, tears in her eyes. "No, baby. I was just a mother who stayed standing when it got hard." He carried her story like armor. At school, he became the one who sat with the kid who ate alone. He offered his lunch to those who forgot theirs. He corrected teachers when they made assumptions, not because anyone told him to, but because he had seen what compassion could do. It wasn't a lesson he read in a book. It was the rhythm of his childhood, the invisible language his mother had spoken with every act of quiet defiance. Back in her own community, the mural at the grocery store had begun to fade from years of sunlight. The artist returned, unpaid, and restored it. But this time, they added something new, a line of smaller figures surrounding the central mother and child. All kinds of people, young, old, different races, different lives, standing with her. Beneath them, in fresh paint, read, "No one stands alone." And as the mother walked past that mural, bag of groceries in hand, she paused to touch the edge one more time. Not for nostalgia, but for reminder that her hardest day had become her most powerful gift, and the world hadn't just remembered it, it had answered. Years later, she stood outside a new shelter opening in the city. It was named the Line Center, after the very idea she had once lived through. She hadn't built it. Others had taken up that work. But she had been invited to cut the ribbon, her son now beside her, taller than she, his arm gently around her shoulders. As she stood in front of the crowd, mothers, social workers, donors, children, she felt a deep, steady peace settle in her chest. She didn't speak long. She didn't need to. "We all have a story," she said simply. And sometimes, the world won't ask for it. Sometimes, it'll try to write one for you. But if you hold on, if you stay standing, you can reclaim the pen. Her son squeezed her hand as the ribbon fell, and the doors opened to a space where no one had to prove they were worthy of help. Inside, the walls held artwork drawn by local kids. One sketch caught her eye, a crayon drawing of a woman holding a baby in one arm, a shopping bag in the other. She had no crown, no cape, but she was surrounded by light. At the bottom, a child had written, "This is what strength looks like." She stood there, tears quietly slipping down her cheeks. Not from sadness, not even from pride, but from something deeper, completion. The kind of peace that only comes when you've taken your pain, planted it, and watched it grow into something that feeds others. And as the sun dipped low and the lights of the shelter turned on one by one, the mother turned to her son and whispered, "We didn't just survive, baby. We helped the world remember how to love." In the quiet corners of our everyday lives, there are moments that pass unnoticed until one stops the world, not with noise, but with truth. This story was never just about a pack of diapers, a denied card, or a woman misunderstood. It was about everything we often choose not to see: the silent strength of mothers, the devastating power of judgment, and the small, extraordinary revolutions that begin with a single act of kindness. What could have ended as another forgotten humiliation became a spark, one that ignited compassion far beyond the aisles of that store. As time passed, her story transformed, not through headlines, but through lives. A whisper in a grocery line, a quiet donation left on a shelf, a hand extended without condition. This was never about grand gestures. It was about the courage to remain kind when the world is indifferent. It was about the sacred power of saying, "I see you," when someone most needs to hear it. And in that recognition, something rare was born, not charity, but dignity restored. She didn't seek the spotlight. She never asked to be remembered. But her strength reshaped a city's conscience and planted seeds in strangers' hearts. Her story wasn't the end. It was the beginning of thousands more. Stories of people who now choose to look again, to pause before assuming, to help without hesitation. Her pain became a bridge, and her resilience, a map. And through it, we were all invited to walk a little closer to each other. So now, ask yourself, how many stories have we passed by without reading? How many faces have we ignored, when all they needed was to be seen? This isn't just a reminder of what one mother endured. It's a call to remember what we are capable of. Compassion isn't weakness. It is strength, precisely because it demands presence, patience, and courage in a world that often rushes past those who fall behind. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes, softened your heart, or made you reflect, then let that feeling live on. Share your thoughts in the comments, so others know they are not alone. Like this video if you believe stories like hers deserve to be told. And subscribe to this channel, so we can continue to honor voices that remind us we are never just bystanders. We are part of the story, and what we choose to do can change everything.